Zander by B.T. Bard. Chapter 1. Seeing the World. Zander was perfectly content bouncing on his trampoline in the backyard. Doing simple tricks and an occasional backflip made him work up a sweat. He admired the unusual changes in the world around him while bouncing. With his eyes playing tricks, trees and bushes appeared to be the things moving. Looking up at the sky made him dizzy, but he kind of liked it. Daydreaming was a relaxing pastime for a teenager like Zander, especially during summer vacation. He imagined being able to have an enormously springy jump and clearing not only his house with a flying leap, but also his neighbor's house across the street. Then he would land with a huge splash in their pool, soaking their windows. It would be an awesome feat indeed. A neighbor and his only claimed friend, Brian, meandered into Zander's yard. "Hey, Z," Brian casually waved, then took a seat on a nearby stump. "Hey, Bri, what are you up to?" Brian replied, "Not much." After a couple more minutes on the trampoline and ending with a backflip, Zander let Brian have a turn. Zander went in the house to grab a couple of sodas for them. The two buddies talked about an online video game for a bit, then they shared stories about their past town fair experiences. This year's fair was going to be set up the following weekend, and they were getting excited. For a good half hour, they shared stories about some dangerous encounters, funny happenings, exciting rides, good junk food, and games they remembered winning. Hearing laughter enticed Zander's little sister Cindy to venture over to the boys. "What's so funny?" Just then their mom called out, "Cindy!" "Be right back," she assured them as she ran into the house. Shortly after, she ran back. "Mom wants to know if you and Brian want a snack." Zander replied, "Come on," gesturing for Brian to follow him. He willingly accepted. "Don't mind if I do." After they shared some popcorn and a jerky stick, Brian went home. Later that evening, after a delicious chicken and biscuit dinner, Zander sat in the living room with his family to relax for a bit in front of the television. He was waiting for the baseball scores to be listed on the news when suddenly, to his dismay, "Not another bombing," he said under his breath as he sank farther into his chair. Zander could hardly take hearing the explosions and seeing the people scattering in the street. He felt his body heat up as he began to hold his breath, and he felt his eyes welling up. He quickly got up from the couch and went upstairs to his room. He didn't want his father to see him, now finally a teenager, getting emotional from watching the news. His heart spoke to his head. Who is going to take care of the scared little baby left alone and hungry on the dusty city street? Who is going to explain to that cute young girl that her home was blown up with her pet cat inside? How would that old Syrian woman deal with the agony of having a metal rod piercing through her arm, and would she die from it? Other scenarios circled around in his mind as he thought about the devastating effects felt by so many people. What could I, a boy from the opposite side of the globe, do? The question tormented him. Zander lay on his bed and tuned into some alternative music. He tried to forget about those strangers and to lighten his mood. Then he played a racing video game and vegetated for an hour, still trying to forget. But when he finally lay down at bedtime, those horrific images flashed in his mind as he closed his eyes and tried to go to sleep. He couldn't help feeling a mixture of guilt and appreciation as he lay there in his warm, soft, comfortable bed. His stomach felt full from dinner. He knew that he and his family would be able to sleep safely through the night. It took a while before he stopped seeing reruns of the violent images in his mind. He found it difficult to stop thinking about the many people's lives that changed in dramatic ways in an instant that day. But since there was nothing he could possibly do about it but pray for them, that's what he did. He left it in God's hands and eventually went to sleep. In the morning, he thought of how displaced the people of Syria must be feeling. He was surprised about how much that broadcast affected him and stayed on his mind. Although he had always been empathetic, he was usually able to shake it by the next day. Zander begrudgingly pushed himself to get out of bed, and then he stretched out his arms as he yawned. His expression appeared to be one of discouragement and defeat. He tried to take his mind off the fact that negative circumstances were happening all over the globe. Then it got closer to home. There was a homeless guy behind the neighborhood grocery store who had a really rough time whenever the weather was extreme. About a mile away, his mom knew the niece of a lonely middle-aged lady who went by the name Mrs. N. She used to work as a cleaning lady in the hospital, but now she simply stayed at home all the time. A car sat in her driveway with 2 flat tires. Various rubbish was scattered around her yard, and she was often seen rocking on her porch while holding a cat in her lap and wearing a crooked smile. She housed many cats and dogs in her small home. Mrs. N may have craved human company, but at least she wasn't homeless. However, it seemed like it would just be a matter of time before the county would condemn her home. Zander shook his head as if he wanted to shake his thoughts. Then he turned on his computer to see if his buddy Brian was awake. It was 7:30 on Saturday morning, which was unusually early for Zander to be awake on the weekend. To his surprise, Brian wrote back to his message. He was playing an online game with Dungeons and Dragons. Zander happily joined in. Out of the blue, Zander received an odd email from a sender named B4, which read, "Did you receive this transmission? Please confirm." Zander simply dismissed the email and continued gaming. After an hour of magic spells, twisting mazes, and bizarre encounters with strange characters, Zander's mind was engaged in the turmoil of a surreal world. This kind of worry he could handle. Chapter 2. The Manorville Fair. Finally, the fair had been set up in town, and Zander was anxious to go. Since he had to go out of town with his family the first weekend to attend his cousin's wedding, he had to wait a whole extra week to go to the fair. This was difficult because all week long the neighborhood kids had been talking about all the wonderful things they had seen and done. His parents promised to take him the following Sunday, which was the last day it would be set up. The fair came around only once a year, so Zander was anticipating the fun he would have. Saturday seemed like the longest day ever because Zander knew there were lots of people having great fun at the fair, and he wasn't one of them. He was anxious for the day to get over with. He was very bored at his great-uncle's 90th birthday party. He just couldn't wait to get to the fair the next day. All he kept thinking about was the cotton candy, the loop ride, the zipper ride, and the fried dough. During the party, his grandparents talked about how they would miss having him come over for their usual Sunday get-together. However, they were glad that Zander was going to have fun at the fair. They discussed some of the possibilities for the following Sunday, including a game they liked playing called Bananagrams. The next morning finally came. Zander was already dressed and had eaten cereal. He thought the wait was over, but then he had to sit around while his family ate breakfast, took showers, and got dressed. Every time he asked his parents if they could leave, they had another excuse for him to wait. His dad had just gotten out of the shower, and his little sister had finally put her clothes on. Just when they were getting closer to leaving, their neighbor Missy, Brian's mom, rang the doorbell. Zander rolled his eyes in anticipation. What was going to hold them up now? All the waiting was making him frustrated. Surprisingly, Missy was wondering if Zander wanted to go with her and Brian to the fair. Zander's parents gave him a choice, and he easily decided that he would like to go with his best friend. "Brian's waiting in the van," Missy pointed outside. "Thanks," Zander said as he headed toward the door. "Here, Zander." His father made him hesitate while he handed him a $20 bill. He thanked his dad and waved to his family as he opened the door. "See you there." He was finally on his way. When they got to the fair, Zander did everything he wanted to do and more. The fun house was freaky and hysterical. The Ferris wheel was spectacular. He could see the whole town when he was at the very top. He was also pleasantly surprised to discover a new ride called the Wind Tunnel, which he loved. Before 11 o'clock, Zander had eaten some fried dough, a corn dog, and almost an entire bag of cotton candy. The lump in his stomach did not hold him back from playing games and going on as many rides as possible. During the day, Zander met up with his family for a short while. He and his dad went on a wild ride. He let his mom take a couple of pictures, and he took Cindy on a few kiddie rides. It was nearing 7 o'clock in the evening when they met up again. At that time, Zander bragged to his family about how he had gone on every ride at the Manorville fair at least twice, played all the games he had wanted to, and even won a metal slide whistle at the ball bounce game. His parents decided it was time to leave. However, they allowed Zander to get a ride back with Missy and Brian. Missy mentioned that they might stay for about another hour, so they had to stick closer together. The boys walked with her to an area where craft vendors were selling their wares. She told the boys to wait there while she went into a colorful tent with a sign that read, "Madame Lightly." "Who's Madame Lightly?" Zander inquired. Brian explained that the lady in the closed tent was a psychic. She could tell you things about yourself that only you might know. She would predict things about your future, and she might tell you things about people around you. Zander was curious. When Missy came out, Zander was not shy asking her about what the lady had told her. Missy explained that she was one of the best psychics she had ever received a reading from. She said that Madame Lightly was very knowledgeable, but also a little bizarre. She knew a lot about Missy and her family, and she predicted some life changes Missy had been wondering about, such as a new job and a new love interest. She also told Brian's mom about some things that seemed too far out there to believe. Zander was very intrigued about what the lady might tell him. He asked if he could talk with Madame Lightly. Missy wasn't sure how his parents felt about psychics, so she told Zander that she would prefer that he didn't see her without their approval. Zander was bummed out, but he didn't make a fuss. Instead, he waited until Missy was busy looking around at the craft tables. He knew once she started talking to those vendors, she would be busy for a while, especially since she was a crafter herself. That's when he grabbed Brian's arm and went over to the colorful tent. He asked Brian to wait there and keep a lookout while he went into the tent to talk to the psychic. Brian wasn't too happy about the idea. Zander promised to make it quick. Zander gave the psychic his last $3, then asked her to tell him whatever she could as fast as she could because his family was getting ready to leave. The lady looked at him with squinted eyes. She tilted her head up slightly, and then she told Zander to sit. She told him that a reading typically costs $5, and that she knew he had snuck into her tent without permission. But she just had to tell Zander something that would change his life forever. She said that he must listen carefully and seriously, and that he must repeat what she was going to tell him only to people whom he knew would take him seriously. This is what Madame Lightly told Zander. You are capable of entering a portal into another world just above the red dog made of rubber that is in your backyard. You will be able to go through it by eating 2 handfuls of the miniature trees, by drinking 8 ounces of the liquid with no color, and by jumping 3 feet high on a windy day. The mystical lady also told him that he would experience a new energy, a new view, a new outlook, and a new respect for life. Her eyes blinked slowly, and her voice began to fade as she said, Remember when the cow that jumps over the moon after the giant consumes the trees. Your sister's name is Cindy. She paused for a moment, as if confused. Then she told Zander to be sure to have light thoughts during the light breeze. Lastly, she told him that she didn't really understand what she was saying, but that his time was up. As Zander was leaving, he turned back to thank her for her time. However, Madame Lightly appeared to be nearly falling asleep as her eyelids closed and she placed her head on her folded arms. That was weird, Zander said to himself. When Zander left the tent, Brian was still waiting there. Brian asked him to hurry along and get back near the craft area with him. Zander was very anxious to tell Brian all about what the psychic had said, but she had told Zander not to tell anybody without giving it some careful thought. She did say some completely nonsensical things, but Zander wondered how she knew that he had a sister named Cindy. He decided that he would try to remember everything she had told him and to write it all down when he got home. Zander was very quiet during the drive home, while he tried to remember all the bizarre things the lady had said. Missy asked if he was feeling all right because Zander seemed distant. He told her his stomach didn't feel right after his 3rd helping of fried dough. She believed him. When Zander got home, he quickly washed up, brushed his teeth, and put on his pajamas. He said goodnight to his family and told them he was tired from the day. He got out his notepad and a pencil, propped up his pillows, and hopped into bed. Zander quickly began writing every specific detail he could remember. Eat 2 handfuls of miniature trees. Drink an 8-ounce glass of something that has no color. Jump 3 feet high. These all sounded quite ridiculous. He wondered what Madame Lightly had meant by the red rubber dog. The only thing besides a swing and a tree fort in his backyard was the trampoline. That's rubber, he thought. Did it have to be a windy day? Was the colorless liquid water? The strange sequence didn't make sense either. Eat 2 handfuls of tiny trees? Come on. That sounds impossible, he thought. The drink has no color. It must be water. He wondered why she hadn't said clear liquid or simply water. What exactly was this portal? He got out of bed to look up the word portal in his dictionary. It got his curiosity flowing. He was supposed to have a new outlook somehow. It all sounded so strange, but interesting. He liked figuring things out, and this was certainly going to be like solving a mystery or a puzzle. He decided that he would get up a little earlier in the morning so he could check out his trampoline before everyone woke up. Then he set his alarm and fell asleep. Chapter 3. Figuring Things Out. Zander got right out of bed in the morning. He threw on a shirt and a pair of shorts, and then he went to the backyard. Boy, was he surprised when he found that the tag on the underside of his trampoline read, Clifford Manufacturing Company. He immediately thought of his old Clifford the Big Red Dog books. That made sense to Zander. Red dog, rubber. His trampoline fit. Zander felt a little tingle of excitement run down his spine. How did that lady know I would figure out the red dog part? That is so weird, he whispered. When Zander went back inside, his mom was drinking a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. She was surprised to see Zander up and about so early, especially during summer vacation. When she asked him what he was doing in the backyard, he simply told her he was checking something out. He was glad that his little sister, Cindy, started crying about something from the other room. It distracted his mom. Zander didn't want her to ask him any more questions. Later that day, Zander was surprised to discover his second clue while he was at the park during summer recreation day camp. He overheard one of his fellow camp counselors giving a simple art lesson about color theory. As Zander sat nearby playing checkers with one of the campers, something struck in his mind as he listened to the lesson. "Ha!" he blurted out. His opponent looked curiously at him. Zander understood that white contains no color. "It could be milk," Zander whispered under his breath. He was happy to realize that the colorless liquid that Madame Lightly had spoken about could very possibly be a white beverage, such as milk. After recreation, Zander had promised to take Cindy to the school playground. 7-year-olds do not forget such things. When they got there, he happened to ask her if she knew what they were having for dinner. "I think we're having ham, corn, and little trees." Cindy wiggled her head as she said trees, and then giggled. He knew his eyes must have bugged out. "Trees? What are you talking about?" She snidely responded, "Broccoli. What do you think? Oak trees?" Zander smirked. Cindy cocked her head. "What? I always pretend I'm a giant when Mom makes broccoli. It just makes them more fun to eat for some reason." "Another clue," Zander murmured. "What?" she asked. "Oh, nothing," he replied. "Do you want me to push you on the swing?" "Yes, yes, yes!" Cindy squealed as she ran to them. Zander now felt he had figured out 3 clues. Strangely, things seemed to be coming together. He was also getting excited to tell someone about it. That night, he wrote notes on a pad before drifting off to sleep. The following morning, Brian surprisingly wasn't on the bus. By the end of day camp, Zander could hardly wait to tell Brian about the mysterious reading. He painstakingly waited for the buses to load. Even though he felt juvenile and gullible for believing in psychic mumbo-jumbo, he was anxious to get home. In his mind, Zander initially made fun of the reading, dismissing it by thinking that the psychic was some old lady having a sugar low or something. Although there were many strange things that she said, they somehow seemed to be falling into place. Plus, Zander couldn't forget about her knowledge of his sister's name. Since the clues were beginning to make some sort of sense, he didn't want to think about it all by himself anymore. Zander was certainly hesitant to see his reaction, but he couldn't wait to share the odd reading and clues with Brian. It was exciting, yet a little unnerving. What if that lady was right about the whole portal thing? He thought Brian might think he was crazy. Thoughts were churning in his mind. As soon as Zander got home, he called Brian on the phone. "Hey, where were you today, Bri?" Brian answered, Dentist appointment. Sorry, I forgot to tell you." Zander asked Brian if he would meet him at his tree fort after dinner. "I'm not sure. I'll call you later." "You've got to come over," demanded Zander. "I've got something to tell you that you just won't believe," he explained. Brian had never heard Zander so hyped up. "All right. Okay, I'll see you later," Brian assured him. "Thanks, pal. See you later," said Zander. And then he instructed, 6:30, okay? Brian responded, "You bet." Even though it was only 6:12, after dinner Zander went right outside and climbed up to his tree fort. Brian was already there waiting for him. Well?" he anxiously asked. "Slow down, Bri. Let me get out my notepad," Zander said. He went over everything the psychic had told him. Brian listened quietly and intently. When Zander was finished, Brian said, "Whoa, sounds like she was on drugs or something." "I know," Zander said. Brian added, "It sounds like something out of a cartoon sci-fi movie or something." Zander nodded. "That's why we need to keep it to ourselves." They agreed that people would probably think they were crazy and had made up the whole thing for attention. Plus, Zander reminded Brian that he didn't have permission to visit the psychic in the first place. Brian promised that he would not tell a soul. "Zander, are we really going to go through with it and try to enter a portal?" Brian asked. "What else are we busy doing? Besides, this is the last week of camp." "True," Brian replied. They both laughed with an uneasiness. Although they agreed that the notion sounded too unreal and wacky, they were both intrigued by the possibility of another realm, another world. They also discussed the possibility that the psychic could have been in a half-dream state, which could have been the reason why she fell asleep after Zander's reading. Even so, they thought it would be fun to try and follow her instructions. It was at least good for a laugh. What seemed somewhat sketchy was whether a particular sequence should occur. They figured everything probably had to happen in some kind of order for this supposed portal excursion to happen. They agreed that they would talk more about it the following day. Before Brian left that evening, Zander showed him the tag on the trampoline that referred to the red dog. Brian was impressed. Zander went to bed that night thinking wondrous thoughts about the possibilities that could be. He was especially intrigued by the notion that he could obtain a new outlook and a new energy. Brian also had some incredible thoughts he couldn't wait to share with Zander on the bus ride the next day. What if Madame Lightly was right? What if they could transport through a portal? What could they discover? The next day, Zander's sister was bored and looking for something to do. When she heard the boys in the tree fort, she went up to see what they were doing. She overheard them talking about a psychic and a portal. When they noticed that Cindy was there, Zander twitched, then immediately hid his notepad. And when she asked what they were talking about, Brian quickly made up some story about a television program. In an attempt to change the subject, Zander invited Cindy to jump on the trampoline with them. Zander purposefully walked through some partially dried mud on the way because he knew Cindy would not want to jump on a dirty trampoline. After Zander's turn, he held his hand out to help her up. After seeing the specks and smears of dirt that Zander's sneakers had made, Cindy changed her mind about the trampoline and went back inside the house. Brian congratulated Zander on his smart and sneaky thinking skills. Then they jumped for a bit while discussing their plans. "We better practice getting high enough," said Brian. They took turns holding a yardstick at the top edge of the trampoline to see how high they could jump. 3 feet was pretty high, but they got close to it. It had suddenly dawned on Brian that the psychic's weird line about eating trees after the cow jumps over the moon could mean that they had to drink the milk before eating the broccoli. Zander jotted that down. When Zander's mother Grace called him in for lunch, he and Brian planned to meet again at the tree fort after supper. At about 6:15, they met again and discussed everything they needed to do to prepare for an actual portal jump. Their mission was to watch the Weather Channel as much as possible in order to predict a good windy day. Then they would plan on requesting broccoli on that day. They planned on having backpacks prepared with food, bottled water, string, matches, pocket knives, and a few other lightweight items, in case they needed them. They were getting excited about the possibility of an adventure, but also nervous about venturing into an unknown territory without anyone knowing of their whereabouts. Brian decided he would write a letter to his mother in the event that they became trapped in some kind of alternate universe, and he planned on placing it on his desk the day of their attempt. Although deep down Zander thought the whole concept of portal travel was far-fetched, he wanted to keep the possibility real when discussing it with Brian, so he kept his skepticism to himself. Zander was also reluctant about the idea of Brian leaving a note because he didn't want to get into trouble about going to talk with the psychic. However, he realized that being in trouble wouldn't be as bad as being lost forever. Besides, he knew that Missy was probably the best resource to inform when it came to psychics and other dimensions and such. They agreed that she was pretty open-minded and understanding. Chapter 4. Planning to Travel. Friday morning came. While hanging out at the park during recreation, Brian and Zander discussed the windy forecast that was predicted for Saturday. Perhaps a lunch at Zander's house the next day would be a good time to try to jump through the portal. To get ready for their possible adventure, their backpacks had to be ready. The only thing they hadn't really confirmed was whether they should eat raw or cooked broccoli. Since Missy was vegan and always had a lot of fresh produce, they decided that Brian would simply grab some raw broccoli from his refrigerator. "It's one of her favorite vegetables, so I'm sure my mom will have some," reassured Brian. Just then, Zander had an inkling. "You know, trees aren't warm and mushy. I think raw sounds like the way to go." "Okay," Brian agreeably nodded. After a long discussion about their plans, the boys decided they weren't quite sure about the meaning of light thoughts. Could it mean thinking about a feather floating? Or was Madame lightly talking about feeling happy and carefree? They determined the easiest way to find out was to casually interview the members of their families in order to take some kind of survey. They planned to compare their notes afterward. Just as the boys were finishing their discussion, a little robin fell out of its nest and lay motionless on the short grass. Zander gently helped guide it to its feet. It faltered for a few seconds, and then it began flapping its wings. In a matter of less than a minute, it took off in flight. Zander smiled. He felt pleased to be able to help the bird. Brian commented, "Very cool, Z." Zander casually tipped his head in agreement. Later that day, they interviewed their families. After dinner, Brian and Zander got together in the tree fort to compare notes. Zander's sister thought of a fairy when describing light thoughts. His dad told him that thinking lightly could mean not thinking too hard or too much about anything. Zander's mom reminded him of the story of Peter Pan because he could fly when he thought happy thoughts. Brian's mother, Missy, explained that light thoughts to her meant meditating and freeing your mind of clutter, which is basically not paying attention to all the unnecessary stuff going on in your mind. Zander seemed a little confused. Brian explained, My mom said people are always thinking, like too much, just about all the time. Like, what am I going to have for dinner? I wonder what's on TV tonight. And, am I going to be able to pass the next math quiz? Brian added, You know, I wonder if light thoughts could be about bright things, like thinking of the sun or a lamp. Zander replied, That's a possibility too, I guess. It seems like the only way to figure this out is by going over all the possibilities and really trying to figure out what the psychic might have meant. Otherwise, we're going to have to try every idea, and that might take a long time. Well, we better get to it so we have some time to sort everything out before it gets dark, Brian suggested. Okay, agreed Zander with a sigh. It was nearly 8:30 when they finally decided that since Brian's mom seemed to think the most like the psychic lady, and since she seemed to be the most spiritually alternative-minded, her answer was probably the one to go with. Besides, they realized that Zander's dad had a similar answer, so the odds were in their favor. Now the only thing the boys had to figure out was how to clear their minds. This was going to be very challenging, especially because they were anxious about what it would be like if they actually did transport into another dimension or land. After much thought, Brian suggested that he could blow bubbles while Zander was bouncing on the trampoline. They agreed that looking at bubbles floating around might help them to see the lightness of something. They also thought the bubbles could distract them from being nervous about the possibility of actually going through a portal. Plus, bubbles are fun. Chapter 5. The Big Day. The time had come and the day seemed perfect. There was a light breeze with clear skies. Zander's mother, Grace, made the boys bologna sandwiches. Zander poured them each an 8-ounce glass of milk. Zander gave his mother a kiss and thanked her for making lunch. Zander's mother looked stunned. It was unusual for Zander to kiss her for making him lunch. But she dismissed it and watched the boys take their lunches to the backyard after they claimed they wanted to have a picnic. The boys hurried toward the trampoline and ran behind a nearby bush. They waited a few minutes to be sure that Grace was done in the kitchen before they put on the backpacks they had stored nearby. Then they each ate 2 handfuls of broccoli, which was a little hard to swallow, and guzzled their 8 ounces of milk. When they finished, they gave a friendly fist tap. Zander took a deep breath and said, "Here we go, pal." He jumped onto the trampoline, and Brian grabbed the bubbles. Zander began to bounce lightly while repeating, "I'm not thinking, I'm not thinking." Brian began blowing bubbles and chanting, "We're just looking at bubbles. We're just looking at bubbles." In his mind, Brian was very doubtful that anything would happen. Zander began to jump a little higher, and then suddenly he stopped and shouted, "Hold on! Who's going to blow bubbles for you, Brian? I mean, how will you get through after me?" Brian answered, "Well, I was hoping that I would just try not to think much and be able to jump through after you." "Are you sure?" Zander asked. "Yeah, sure. I think I'll be able to. I mean, I'm going to try my best," Brian replied. "I hope so," Zander said in a questioning tone. "Don't worry," assured Brian. Zander began jumping again, while Brian continued blowing bubbles. Zander was jumping higher and higher while repeating the statement, "I'm not thinking." It appeared as though Zander was reaching the right height. Brian noticed that Zander had a seriously focused look on his face. Brian looked down to put his bubble wand back into the container, and when he looked back up, he found that his friend had vanished into thin air. The trampoline was left with a slight vibration. Brian gasped at the realization of what had just occurred. He stood there with his mouth wide open. Bubbles slowly floated toward the ground. Some popped on the trampoline. Brian looked a little freaked out. His mind raced as he suddenly felt a sense of uneasiness. With a lump in his throat and his heart beating at rapid speed, he raced to his house and spilled the entire story to his mother. Missy tried to understand this most unbelievable story from her always believable son. However, she found it all very hard to grasp. Brian was obviously shaken up, quite serious, and certainly anxious for his mother to help in some way. After some time, Brian was able to calm down enough to explain the entire story to his mom. Although she found his explanation to be unusual and inconceivable, she had no reason to doubt his honesty in the past. Brian was glad to have an understanding mother, but he questioned how she would be able to help. Meanwhile, Zander was in another place. Was it another dimension? Was it another planet? It was most definitely not in his backyard. It was a place that seemed far different from where he lived. That was for sure. Zander stood there in awe. He noticed the colors around him were extra bright. It appeared as though he was looking through a pair of yellow-tinted sunglasses. In the near distance, on the very top of a hill, he saw a large castle. Suddenly he was distracted by a low-flying bird that seemed to be saying, "Hi there, hi there." However, it didn't look like any bird he had ever seen before. For one, it didn't appear to have a beak, and something furry and strange was attached to its head that almost looked like a tail. It perched on a large stump and proceeded to stare at Zander. He thought the bird looked somewhat human. He looked at the little bird's feet. It had toes. That's wild, Zander thought to himself. His mind shifted to his concern about Brian. He wondered where Brian was and began asking himself many questions. Did Brian make it through somewhere nearby? Did he go to a different place altogether? Did Brian chicken out and stay in Manorville? He sat on a rock and waited for Brian for about 10 minutes while he watched the unusual bird. When he started to approach the bird to get a better look, it took off. As it flew up, it screeched, "The cause can help!" Even though he was somewhat leery and taken aback by the bird-like creature that could speak, he followed it to a nearby building before the bird flew out of sight. It looked like an enormous, oversized shed. He entered through the gigantic door. The floor and walls were made of a type of cement or mud that was smooth to the touch and resembled plastic. Unlike mud, the surfaces were quite colorful. As he walked slowly and cautiously around a corner, he found himself looking at an oddly bizarre image of himself. Upon further observation, he realized that he was looking into a large glass jar. As he continued walking, he noticed other extremely large objects around the room. There was a spoon, a bowl, a broom, a table, and a stool. He could easily walk right into the fireplace. The enormity of the items around him made Zander feel tiny. He felt nervous when it occurred to him that these things must belong to a very, very large person. Maybe this person wasn't friendly. Was he in the home of a monster? Quickly he made his way back outside. While looking behind him, Zander ran into a light greenish-colored column. He backed up and looked up. Then Zander realized what he had run into appeared to be some sort of tree. As he stood there, a large, tank-sized beetle crawled nearby. Zander felt frightened at first, until he realized that it had no interest in him. He wondered where that talking bird had gone. Before wandering off, Zander walked back to where he had originally come from. He grabbed a piece of paper and a purple marker from his backpack. Then he wrote a large capital Z and an arrow pointing in the direction he planned to go. He stuck the paper through a prickly hooked branch on a bush near the spot where he entered from the portal. He felt that if Brian eventually made it through, the sign would be able to direct him to go in the same direction as him. As he walked along, he occasionally glanced up in the sky looking for the interesting bird he had seen. He thought if he could talk to the bird, it might be able to help him stay safe while he explored the unusual, fascinating new land. Meanwhile, other thoughts and questions filled his head. Besides being concerned for his safety, he wondered how he would ever be able to get back home through the portal. His very first experience with portals required a trampoline, broccoli, and milk. He had none of those things with him, which caused an even bigger concern. As Zander continued exploring, he observed a very colorful sky, very smooth-looking trees, and brooks with the clearest water he had ever seen. As he was taking it all in, he unknowingly stepped into something white, frothy, and wet. He had no idea what it was, but it resembled a mixture of soda and cake icing. It was very sticky, and he was very stuck. By the time he worked his way out of it, he was exhausted. Zander rested for a moment as he looked around and tried to decide which direction to go. The castle on the hill in the distance intrigued him. Maybe a king lives there, or perhaps someone magical, he thought. If so, maybe they would be able to help him get back home. He was hopeful yet skeptical, but he had to do something. Brian hadn't shown up, and he wasn't finding the talking bird. Besides, he didn't have another goal after getting through the portal. What else was he going to do? Zander began talking to himself. Why didn't I think this through? I know why, because I didn't plan on actually going anywhere. Where the heck is Brian? Ugh, this is so not cool. I'm such a dope. Zander smacked himself in the head as he rolled his eyes. Then he took a deep breath. He had to try to find someone or something to help him figure out how to return home. His best bet was to make the long trek to the castle on the hill, so that's what he set out to do. During his hike, he couldn't help feeling both exhilarated yet let down. On the one hand, he really couldn't believe he had made it through the portal to this extraordinary place. On the other hand, he couldn't believe how he could have done such a thing without knowing how he would get back. He was very worried he might never see his family again. Another concern was Brian. What had happened to him? Was he all right? Although many questions circled in Zander's mind, he knew that he must focus on the task at hand. He tried to keep the castle in sight as he ventured through the unknown land. As he walked through the odd trees, he began smelling a faint, familiar scent. Something about it reminded him of his mother's cooking. He came upon other sticky stuff here and there, and he was happy to avoid it. There were quite a few hairy-looking shrubs with orange trunks in one area. In another area, there were many brown, rounded rocks with speckles. When his feet became tired, he sat on one of the rocks. It felt strange because it seemed to feel a little softer than the rocks he was used to. He took out his pocket knife and stuck it into the soft rock. Zander was shocked that the knife could dig into it and surprised to find out that under the surface it was white and juicy. That familiar scent became slightly stronger. He had never seen or heard of such a rock. It did remind him of something familiar, but he just couldn't place it. After a short break, he continued on. He walked up a steep and slippery green-striped path to get a good view. When he reached the top, he lost his balance and slipped over the edge into a reddish pond of slush. He freaked out at first because it felt warm to the touch. It also had an unusual texture, which was a mixture of dark pink lumpy chunks in an opaque pinkish liquid. When Zander noticed what looked like black oval-shaped bugs floating in it, He jumped out in a flash. A moment later, Zander realized that he was very familiar with this weird reddish pond. Some of it got on his lips and gave him a little taste. He was delightfully surprised to discover that it was a pond of sweet watermelon juice. When he looked at the place he had fallen from, he could see that the green path he had taken was actually the outside of a gigantic watermelon. That's why it was so smooth and slippery. The watermelon pond was made by a crack in the underside of it, where juice had leaked out onto the ground. He felt foolish when he looked more closely at the bugs he was afraid of. They were just big seeds. Zander was excited to see an enormous watermelon. "I feel so tiny," he said to himself. "Everything's so big here." He glanced around while he enjoyed eating some of the watermelon. It was both delicious and thirst-quenching. Zander still had the urge to take a look at the landscape ahead, so he made the walk up the watermelon again. This time he was more careful. When he reached the top, he saw many green trees in the forest to the left. To the right, he saw the large meadow of droopy green trees with large orange trunks. Earlier, he had seen them up close, but now from a higher vantage point, he realized something. That looks strange. They're all in rows. It almost looks like they were purposefully planted. He wondered out loud. "Whoa!" he gasped. "It looks like a farm field." "Hey, those trees look like gigantic carrots," he said excitedly, as if a light bulb went off in his mind. "And the soft brown rocks are potatoes." Yep, that is right," a voice said. "Huh?" Zander wondered as he looked around. "I said, yep," the voice repeated. "Who said that?" Zander asked. "Me," the bird-like creature answered as it flew over his head. "Oh, I was wondering where you were," Zander explained. "Really? Why is that?" the bird asked. Zander replied, "Because I thought you might be able to direct me to that castle over there and help me figure some things out. I just got here and I really don't know my way around. I'm pretty confused." The creature replied, "About what?" "Well, a lot," answered Zander. "Like where I am, how I got here, why there's giant produce everywhere." "I can probably help you with some things," the bird said, "but you really need to talk with the cause." "The cause of what?" asked Zander. "I'm confused," he added. "You are," the bird agreed. Then it explained. "The cause are a colony of very intelligent beings that live in a deep crater. They are the ones who found the seeds that the old giant left behind many years ago, and they planted them in those fields you are looking at," the bird continued. "Wow," replied Zander. "So how far away are they?" he asked. "Not too far from here," the bird answered. Zander asked, "Is it on the way to that castle over there?" "Well, sort of," said the bird. "You'll have to walk all the way around the carrot tops to the right over there, but then you will have a pretty easy walk to the castle," it explained. "Why do you want to go to the castle?" it asked. "Hold on," Zander was distracted. "I can't believe that those are celery stalks growing over there. That's wild," said Zander. He paused and then answered the question. "I figured that someone might be living in the castle who might be able to tell me how I can get back home." The bird made a regretful sound. "I am sorry to tell you this, but I really don't think you will find anybody there. In fact, I have never known of anyone living there," it said. "Oh," Zander replied sadly. "The cause would probably be able to help you the most," reiterated the bird. "Do you think you could take me there?" Zander asked. "I guess so," said the bird. "Well, I'm ready. Let's go," Zander insisted. "Follow me!" chirped the 4-pound human bird. Zander slid down the watermelon and began to follow it. Chapter 6. Meeting a Summoneer. Zander had followed the bird for about 10 minutes. When they got to the carrots, Zander asked the bird to wait. He cut a small piece of the carrot to try. Zander liked the taste of the carrot and thought it was the juiciest one he had ever eaten. It dawned on Zander that he hadn't introduced himself to his flying helper. "Excuse me, but my name is Zander, and I was wondering what to call you." "Well, how do you do, Zander? I am a summoneer, and my name is Telly," it said. "It is the name that was given to me by the cause, because I am their main telecommunications source in and out of the crater," Telly explained. Telly also said that the cause were a large, gentle, and wise species. The cause were the leaders, the growers, the peacekeepers, and the essential component of the highly functioning and well-maintained land. Zander was glad to know Telly, and soon they were on their way again. Telly answered a lot of Zander's questions along their walk, and also offered some interesting information about the land. The summoneer explained that the place Zander was visiting goes by the name of Beanland. One interesting fact about Beanland is that it is never too dark to see. Zander could see that it was a very colorful place. Telly told him that there were some things that he should be wary of. For one, the crater was enormous and deep, and Zander would have to be cautious around it. Other pitfalls to look out for were the many swampy ponds that scattered the land. He told Telly that he had already encountered 2 swamps. Telly had figured as much, judging from the look of Zander's pink-stained clothes. Zander asked, "What is that sticky white stuff?" Telly called it goop. The bird didn't know what it was, but it knew there would be a big problem if its feathers ever came in contact with the stuff. "Oh," remembered Telly, "and avoid flying lights. They could burn you." "Flying lights?" questioned Zander. "They are a sort of creature that we call zappers," Telly explained. "They sound like lightning bugs," said Zander. "Oh, you have them in your land?" asked Telly. "Well, they can't burn you, but they do have lights and they fly. Some people call them fireflies," he remarked. "Well, zappers can definitely burn. I see brown scorch marks on plants and trees all the time. Plus I have known of some harmful incidents with some of the other summoneers. Just be aware," reminded Telly. "Thanks, I will," assured Zander. Then he was curious. "Do they actually sound like electric lightning or something?" Telly replied, "Yes, it is a warning signal. They are so quick that their radial strobes vibrate loudly." "They sound cool," said Zander. "I'd like to see one." Telly gasped. "Oh, believe me, you wouldn't. Please keep clear of them if you are still here during purple time." "All right," Zander agreed, and then queried, "Wait, purple time?" Telly explained, "Yes, the later part of the day. Don't you know about time?" Zander answered, "Yes, I know about times with numbers." Telly was surprised. "Number times?" "Yes," said Zander, "with clocks, you know, watches." "What do you watch for?" Telly inquired. Zander shook his head and explained, "I'm talking about numbers that tell time." "Oh," Telly responded, but the bird obviously didn't grasp the concept. Instead, the summoneer asked, "What are your colors like?" "Just day and night," said Zander. "We don't have color changes like here." Telly asked Zander to describe night and day. Zander explained the following. "The sun shines like a big light in the sky so people can see well during the day. At night, the sun shines on another part of the earth, which makes it hard to see where I live. That's when it's night, and it's dark. At night, the moon glows its light, if it's not cloudy, which makes it a little easier to see outside. Telly looked confused. Cloudy? Zander looked up and noticed that there were no clouds in the sky. Now he also looked confused. Wait a minute, Telly. Can you explain to me how the color light changes? Asked Zander. Oh, it is simple, Telly shared. Gases create filters in conjunction with the magnetic changes of energy fields that occur from air movement and meditation, which alter the lens surrounding our sun. This changes the color hue in the atmosphere in order to adjust its output. Zander expressed, That's really interesting, but it doesn't sound simple to me. What I don't understand is why do you need the color changes? Telly replied, It actually aids in the consistent production of vegetation. It also helps control the interaction of the vast variety of species within the environment. That's amazing, said Zander. Well, it is natural for us here. I suppose it is as natural as the number changes are in your land, Telly surmised. Zander agreed. They both walked in quiet contemplation for a while. During their excursion to the crater, Zander was very curious about Telly. He wanted to know about the other summoneers. He wondered how Telly was able to talk. He asked where Telly lived. He wanted to know what Telly ate. Zander wondered how high Telly could fly. He wanted to know if Telly knew anything about Earth. Where did Telly sleep? The bird was able to answer most of his questions. There are 4 groups of summoneers. They each live in different dwellings high up in the trees, which are located in different areas throughout Beanland. Telly could fly pretty high, but was taught that flying higher than the atmospheric bubble would decrease the capability to breathe, and it would also affect the bird's ability not only to sense direction, but also to think clearly. Telly's favorite things to eat were goo-goo berries, dilly seeds, and melon juice. Telly loved finding ripened cocoa pods and explained that they are a sweet and delicious treat, but they're very difficult for summoneers to open. When they are extra ripe, the pod cracks partially open, making it easier to enjoy. They were Telly's favorites. Zander explained that the animals that can fly on Earth are called birds. He told Telly that all birds have beaks on their faces, which makes it easy for them to peck apart shells and dig into trees and dirt. Telly had never heard of beaks. The only other flying creature in Beanland that is similar to me is a twirly bird. They don't have beaks, and they have arms like you, Telly said. Wow, that's weird. Zander asked, Do they have wings? No, said Telly, but they have feathers. How do they fly if they don't have wings? Asked Zander. With their tails, replied Telly. There are many twirly birds in Beanland. I'm surprised you haven't seen one, Telly said. I really haven't been here for very long, Zander replied. Zander had another curious question for Telly. I am a boy, Zander said. What are you? He asked. Telly sat on a limb, paused for a long moment, and thought. Just a summoneer, Telly answered, and added, I don't consider myself either. I am just Telly. Does it matter? Telly questioned. I suppose not, Zander replied. Just then Zander heard a propeller. He looked up, expecting to spot a small helicopter. There's one now, Telly blurted. What? Where? I don't... Zander responded, and then gazed in amazement. A twirly bird, Telly said. Wow, Zander whispered. He watched as the twirly bird rose up through the trees with its long tail feathers spinning in circles. The twirly bird had a face like a rabbit, yet more elongated. Its body was partially smooth. Its feet had talons, and the top of its head had a tuft of fluffy feathers sticking up. When it reached a high limb, it grabbed on with its human-like hands and swung itself onto the branch. It looked around and made a sort of click-clack sound, pausing here and there. Then Zander heard another twirly bird clicking and clacking. It reminded Zander of the sounds chipmunks and squirrels make. He knew they were communicating, but obviously he did not know what they were saying. "We should keep going, Zander. I am expected somewhere at green time," Telly mentioned. "Green time?" Zander questioned. Telly explained, "Yep, that's when the skylight changes to a green hue. That is when I like to meet up with my family to have some juice and share our day's doings." "Okay, I understand," Zander said. "Could you just explain something to me? Are there other times and colors here?" Zander asked. Yup. We go by 6 different times," Telly answered. The summoner described, "In the very early beginning of my day, it is red time, and then it changes to an orange hue. Yellow time is in the middle of my day. That's when I have the most energy. Green time comes next, and that's when I start slowing down and want to relax. Blue time is when I settle into one of my dwellings, and during purple time I do most of my sleeping." "I think I've got it, Telly. It's just like the colors of the rainbow," Zander said. "You know what a rainbow is?" Telly was surprised that Zander knew about rainbows. "Sure, we have them at home, on Earth, but only once in a while," Zander said. "You know, I've been telling you all about Beanland, but I would like you to tell me some things about your home," Telly requested. So Zander did. He told the summoner all about the sun during the day, the moon and stars at night, the different kinds of water throughout the land, and the different seasons. Telly was quite intrigued and asked for more and more information during the remainder of their trek to the crater. Telly just couldn't believe how big Zander's world sounded in comparison to Beanland. When Zander explained about the country, the city, the buildings, the cars, the animals, the jobs, the food, the stores, the airplanes, the schools, and the Manorville Fair, Telly was just amazed at how different and exciting it all sounded. Zander actually agreed with Telly. He never thought of Earth as such a remarkable place before. Now he did, and that made him even more anxious to get to the crater to find out if the cause could help him get back home. Chapter 7. Getting Help. The trees began to get very tall and very fluffy. The thick canopy made it hard for Zander and Telly to keep an eye on one another. Telly explained that there was a big waterfall ahead and told Zander to continue walking straight toward a bright opening. Zander could see which direction he needed to go. He could just about see the bright clearing ahead, so he told Telly that he would meet up there. Little did Telly know that just around the corner, below a small rocky ledge, was one of those sticky, pink, swampy ponds. Zander could barely fit on the ledge to make it around. In fact, it was a little too small for him. Telly was too late to warn Zander about the hazard ahead, and unfortunately Zander lost his balance when his backpack bumped into the rocky wall. Luckily, it wasn't a far drop, and some cottony bushes broke his fall before he landed in the sticky swamp. Zander anxiously screamed, "Help! Help! I landed in the pink stuff, and it's deep!" he cried out. Telly flew over and explained that, although he would not be able to assist him, he would fly steadfast to the crater and get help from the cause. Telly suggested, just try to move slowly. Don't panic to get out. It will just make you more stuck. I will be back with help as fast as I can. We are very close now, he reassured Zander. Okay, Telly, please hurry, Zander encouraged. Telly flew quickly and brought help in no time. Zander's eyes popped out with surprise when he saw how large the cause was. It must have been at least 8 feet tall. He also felt a big sense of relief because he knew a creature that large would be able to give him a strong helping hand. The cause had a pole in its hand and held it out for Zander to grab onto. Zander clutched it tightly and was pulled out in no time. He was very thankful to the being. Telly was relieved that no harm was done to Zander, except for the very sticky clothes he now wore. The cause directed Zander to go to the waterfall to clean up. Telly, Zander called out. Right up here, Telly replied. We're going to the falls, Zander said. Okay, I will meet you there, agreed Telly. Zander was quite relieved to have the pink glop off of him, and then he told Telly that he was soaking wet and feeling uncomfortable. Don't worry, Telly said. The cause have a grand machine that can dry you quickly, Telly added. Follow me, the friendly cause instructed. Will you come with us? Zander asked Telly. Yes, I will go the rest of the way with you, but I will have to leave when we get to the crater because my others will be looking for me, Telly explained. Thanks, Telly, Zander said appreciatively. Zander sloshed along and followed the cause to the crater. When they got there, Zander thanked Telly for helping him and for making him feel welcomed in Beanland. As they said their goodbyes, they both expressed a hope that they would see each other again one day. Telly then flew away, and Zander followed the cause down a path. After a moment, Zander asked the cause, What's your name? My name is Ziron, said the cause. Oh, my name is Zander. Thank you so much for your help back there, he said. I'm glad to help you, replied Ziron. Zander had so many questions running through his mind, but he decided he would simply walk quietly for a bit. Zander felt quite peaceful and safe with Ziron. He was also beginning to feel quite tired from the day. After a little more walking, the path soon led them to the inside of the crater. It looked like a spiraling maze. It was deep and somewhat intimidating. He was relieved when Ziron stopped and called down a tube to summon someone called Surma, because Zander didn't really feel like going any further. Who's Surma? Zander asked. Surma is the decider. She is the one who will direct you properly, Ziron said kindly. Oh, great, Zander replied. Can Surma help me get back home? Zander asked with hope in his voice. That is a question for Surma, replied Ziron. Now you will need to sit here and wait, Ziron instructed, and stood aside in silence. Zander hesitated with some nervousness and said, Oh, okay. A few seconds later, Zander remarked, Thanks again for helping me. The cause slowly closed his eyes and slightly bowed his head in acknowledgement. As Zander sat there, he noticed a lot of activity in the crater. He heard many different noises in the distance, such as squeaky cranks, hammers, water, and even humming. He could see some activity down the sides of the crater that looked like pulleys being operated. However, most of the activity seemed to be at the very bottom of the crater. Zander was curious about what was going on. After a handful of minutes, Zander heard a motor. The sound got louder and closer. When it stopped, a door opened. A cause wearing ornate accessories stood there. It slowly stepped through the doors. Hello, you must be Zander. I am Surma, said the cause. You seem to have lost your way, she said. What has brought you to Beanland? asked Surma. Zander rambled. Well, I didn't really know where I was going when I got here, because I didn't know whether the psychic was really telling me something truthful or just fooling with me. And when I tried it, and I actually got here, I thought Brian was going to be with me, but he never showed up. And I forgot to find out how I would get back after I got here, so I would really like it if you could help me get back home. I mean, I really like it here, but everyone back home is going to be freaked out when they can't find me. Plus, they probably won't believe Brian, that is, if he is still in Manorville. You see, my parents will probably think that he is making the whole thing up, and they're going to have a really hard time believing him about the whole portal thing. Anyway, do you think you can help me, please? Surma answered, Well, okay. I'm not really sure that I followed your entire story, but I will certainly try to help you get back home if I can. How soon must you return to your home? Asked Surma. Oh, as soon as possible, Zander responded anxiously. Surma replied, Well, then I must call on my assistants and gather some supplies. Then you will take us back to the place from which you arrived. You did mention something about a portal, Zander. Is that right? That's right, replied Zander. Then he took a deep breath. He was beginning to feel more relaxed. That's how I got here, he confirmed. Surma asked, How far would you say the portal entrance is from here? Zander answered, I guess I would say that it's a little over an hour away. Realizing that time was very different, he answered, I have been here during yellow time. He added, It is very close to the small building with the giant furniture. Surma nodded knowingly. Yes, I know the place, she requested. Please wait here, Zander. I will be back soon, and then we will be on our way. Great. Thank you so much, Surma. I really appreciate your help, said Zander. Surma went back through the doors. Meanwhile, in Manorville, Brian and Missy were trying to figure out what to do. They had been searching online, looking for viable information to figure out some sort of way to contact Zander through the portal, but to no avail. Missy was afraid to let Brian go through. She called around to some of her New Age friends, and she casually stirred up conversations about other dimensions to try to find some answers. But that didn't help. Missy decided she would not mention what had happened to Zander unless his parents questioned his whereabouts. It was common for the boys to play at the neighborhood park on the weekends, so Zander's parents had not been worrying about him. After trying to get in contact with the traveling psychic lady and having no success, Missy privately decided that she would consider traveling through the portal herself, if need be. She felt somewhat guilty about Zander's disappearance, since she was the one who had been responsible for Zander at the fair. I feel awful, Missy said to Brian. I should have never told Zander about the psychic, and I shouldn't have left you boys alone, she said remorsefully. It's mostly my fault, replied Brian. His voice wavered from guilt. I let him talk to the psychic. I didn't think he would disappear. I told him I would go too. I'm an awful friend. Missy hugged Brian. It'll be okay. Back in Beanland, Zander was starting to get a little hungry, so he decided to eat half of the peanut butter and jelly sandwich he had packed. He also drank some of his bottled water to wash it down. Shortly after, Surma returned carrying a staff. One assistant wore a handmade backpack, and the other one was carrying a bag. Although Zander was anxious to get going, he felt very comfortable and at peace around the cause beings. He also felt very small. After all, the cause were the tallest beings on two legs Zander had ever seen. Even though their bodies were covered in fur from head to toe, reminding him of Bigfoot, Zander felt that their dispositions gave him the impression of teddy bears. Surma asked Zander to describe the area where he entered into Beanland. When Zander mentioned the enormous oversized shed, the other two Caws knowingly nodded their heads. Surma said, "I believe we know the way. Let's go." About halfway through the trek back to the portal, Zander began lagging behind. His legs were a lot shorter than the Caws's were, so he was jogging and skipping here and there to keep up. Besides, he had been walking quite a bit already that day. The Caws carrying the bag bent down on his knees and asked Zander if he wanted to jump onto his back to be carried for a while. Zander accepted the offer and climbed up. They continued their walk and eventually came upon the shed. Zander knew they were close to the portal now, but he had to figure out which way to go. "I'm not sure where I am," Zander said with some disappointment. Surma asked, "Do you remember which side of the building you came upon?" "Oh, let me think." Yes, I do," Zander replied. "There was a chimney going up the side," he recalled. "Let's find it," Surma said. "Over here," called the Caws wearing the backpack. They all walked to him. "Thank you, Murph," Surma said to her assistant. "So we must walk this way now," she instructed. They began walking straight away from the chimney side of the shed. Zander led them, trying his best to remember anything he could. He was sure he remembered the large grassy bushes, then he recalled some of the hooked shrub branches, and finally he saw a patch of large purple flowers. He was overjoyed when he discovered his baseball cap on the ground. Rushing over and picking it up, Zander said, "It must have fallen off when I came through the portal." He sighed heavily when he looked around and saw no signs of anything that looked like an entrance or an exit. Surma noticed Zander's remorse and concern. "Don't worry," Surma reassured him as she held up her staff. "I have this." Then Surma turned and spoke to Triad, the Caws that had given Zander a piggyback ride. "Please, Triad, hand me my silver powder," Surma requested. Triad reached into the bag he'd been carrying, pulled out a long container, and handed it to Surma. "When you are ready, Zander," Surma said. "You mean you can send me back home right now?" Zander asked, surprised. "Yes," Surma assured him. Zander could hardly believe it. He felt a sense of ambivalence. "Okay," Zander said as he swallowed deeply. He gave each of the Caws a hug and thanked them for their help. Surma nodded happily and then instructed Zander to stand in a particular spot. "Am I going to feel anything?" Zander asked nervously. Surma responded with a smile. "I hope you will feel happy when you return to your home." "Oh, I will," Zander replied, and then he hesitated. "Would it be all right if I came back to visit sometime?" Zander asked. "You are welcome any time, Zander. Take care of yourself and be at peace," Surma said with genuine kindness. "Thank you," Zander gratefully replied. Then, while Zander stood still, Surma shook the silver powder over and next to him while waving the long staff like a wand. A bluish, circular, swirling hole appeared. It was the portal. "Hop in," instructed Surma. Zander jumped into it, and within seconds Zander was in his backyard on the ground next to his trampoline. Coincidentally, Missy and Brian were in Zander's backyard looking around for clues. Very soon after, Zander rolled onto the ground next to the trampoline. Seconds later, Zander's sister came around the corner pedaling her bicycle. "I was just at the park," his sister said with frustration. "Where have you been? And what are you doing on the ground?" Cindy asked. Zander looked pretty tired and very dirty after his adventure to Beanland. He thought fast. Then he answered her while rambling. "Brian and I were playing bounty hunter. I was trying not to get caught. I've been running around, hiding all over, but he just caught me, and now he has to take me to headquarters at his house." "Yeah, let's go. I've got a warrant, and I'm gonna turn you in," Brian said. He played along and took Zander by the arm as he began walking his friend over to his house. Cindy shouted, "Well, Mom said that I had to find you and let you know that we are going out for dinner tonight, so you better get washed up and changed soon." "I will," Zander yelled back to Cindy as he crossed the street with Brian. Cindy turned to Missy and asked, "What are you doing here, Miss Rubik?" Missy hesitated for a moment. "Oh, yeah, I was going to ask your mother something, but now I have completely forgotten," she answered. Missy began walking away to go back home. "I guess I'll give her a call if I remember. See you later, Cindy," she added. "My mom's right inside, and we're not going to be here later," Cindy explained. "Oh, that's nice. But I just remembered that I have something in the oven. Bye," Missy said hurriedly as she walked away. Cindy squinted in an inquisitive, curious way, and then she parked her bicycle in the garage. When Missy returned home, Brian and Zander were talking excitedly about Zander's experiences in Beanland. Missy interrupted. "Are you all right, Zander? I was so worried. How did you get back? What did you see?" Brian said, "Hold on, Mom. Just sit down." "Sure, okay. Just tell me that you're all right, Zander," Missy said. Zander assured Brian's mom that he was fine, and then he glanced at the clock. "Wow, I've been gone 4 hours," Zander said with wonderment. "I know." "Wait, it's actually been 5 hours," exclaimed Brian. "I've been freaking out," he said. He continued, "and I'm really sorry I didn't follow you through the portal. I never really thought it would work. I was just kind of going along with it for fun, but when you disappeared..." Brian shook his head with disbelief. "I know, me too. I was worried about what happened to you too," Zander replied. Missy interjected, "Well, I'm going to call your mother and ask if you can have a sleepover tonight. You've just got to tell me all about everything that happened. But right now, you better get yourself looking a little more presentable because you have to go home so you can get ready to go out to dinner tonight with your family. Brian, get Zander a towel and a washcloth. I'll pour you a glass of milk. Now go." Missy's voice was full of nervous excitement. "Okay, Mom, he's going," Brian assured her, then said, "Come on, buddy. I'll give you a hand." Brian noticed some pink stains on Zander's clothes. "Did you land in a barrel of cotton candy or something?" he asked. Zander raised his eyebrows. "Later," he answered. He felt as if he had been in a whirlwind of excitement and was hoping he would be able to relax during dinner. While Brian gave Zander a hand, Missy called to get permission for Zander to have a sleepover. After 10 minutes or so, Zander was presentable and feeling a little more back to normal. Zander left his backpack at Brian's house and walked back home. When he walked through the door, he gave his father a big hug. "Hiya, Dad," he said enthusiastically. "Hey, Zander. You doing okay?" his dad asked, surprised by Zander's warmth. "Yeah, sure. I'm great," replied Zander. "I'll be ready to go in about 15 minutes. Is that okay?" asked Zander. "Can you hurry up? I want to play the frog game at the arcade before we go into the restaurant," Cindy blurted out. "I'll try," Zander said. "Take your time, Zander," his mom commented. "I still have to put on my makeup," she added. "Oh, brother," Cindy said with disappointment. Why don't you play some of your video games here while you're waiting, suggested her dad. Yeah, and then I'll be right at a good part and you'll say, "We're ready now, never mind." Cindy walked over to the sofa and plopped herself down. Soon after, they left. Zander was fairly quiet during dinner that evening. He had a lot of things on his mind. His parents looked at each other a couple of times with concerned expressions. Then his dad asked, "How was your day today, Zander?" He looked up after seeming kind of spaced out. He was thinking about his day. "Oh, it was good," he answered hesitantly, yet confidently. "What did you do today, Zander?" his mom asked. He raised his eyebrows. Cindy blurted, "He and Brian were playing Bounty Hunter, and they never even asked me to play, like usual." "Bounty Hunter? That's a new one, huh?" Zander's dad questioned. "Yeah, it was okay. You know, we kept busy. It was fun, just sort of a chasing game," Zander replied nonchalantly. Nobody asked Zander any other questions about his day. Dinner was okay. As soon as they got back home, Zander ran upstairs to grab his sleeping bag. Then he said his good nights to his family and rushed over to Brian's house for their sleepover. He was anxious to tell his best friend all about Beanland. Chapter 8. Telling What Happened. As soon as Zander knocked on the door, Brian turned off the television and yelled, "Mom, he's here!" Missy hurried down the stairs. She told the boys to sit at the kitchen table. Then she served cookies and tea. "All right, Zander. Brian told me what happened with the psychic and how you went about going through the portal. Please tell us everything that happened when you got there," Missy requested with excitement. She and Brian listened intently while Zander talked for almost an hour about his adventure. Afterward, Zander felt good to have shared his experience with someone, but he was pretty tired. Brian and Missy had many questions that Zander wasn't able to answer. They were really amazed by the creatures he saw and his descriptions of the landscape. "Tell me one more time about the cause," Missy requested. "I want you to tell me what that talking bird looked like again," Brian chimed in. Zander replied, "I am really super tired, and I just want to chill out and watch some TV before I go to sleep. Do you mind if I tell you all about it again in the morning?" Zander asked while yawning. Missy and Brian agreed to let Zander relax for the rest of the night. In the morning, Missy made a banana pancake breakfast with scrambled eggs, which the boys happily scarfed up. Then Zander told them about Beanland again. This time he was more descriptive about the creatures he encountered. He explained, "The Caws are super tall, and they have fur like a bear. They wore these sort of sandals wrapped around their feet, and they have really nice, kind eyes. They made me feel really safe. I knew they would never hurt me. They just wanted to help me. They are really smart too, especially Surma. She was the one who helped me get back here using some special powder. Their teeth look a lot like ours, except bigger." "What about their noses?" asked Brian. "They were kind of flat and had a little fur on top. They blended in with their faces," Zander answered. "Maybe that Surma was a wizard," Missy wondered out loud. "Maybe, I'm not sure, but I'm glad I was able to get back home," Zander responded. "Me too," Brian said. "They said that I could go back any time and visit again," Zander said. "Really?" Missy asked with interest. "Hold on, Mom," said Brian. "I think we've had enough excitement for a little while," he added. "Yes, I've definitely had my share of excitement lately," Zander said. They all laughed. Missy then suggested, "Zander, I was hoping that you would be able to talk with a friend of mine who studies phenomena. I can call and see if he's willing to stop by later." Zander looked hesitant. "What exactly are phenomena?" he asked. "They're like bizarre, otherworldly things that go on," Brian answered. "Yeah, kind of like unexplained happenings. They are mysteries," Missy added. "He might know something about portals and other dimensions. I know he would be extremely interested in talking to you, if you want to," she said. Zander thought about it for a moment. "Well, I guess it wouldn't hurt. I totally want to know about portals and other dimensions. It's a very cool way to travel," Zander said with a smile. "Okay, I'll talk to him," agreed Zander. "Awesome!" exclaimed Brian. Missy went to call her friend in the other room. Meanwhile, Zander and Brian talked about how weird and exciting the whole thing seemed. "It's all set," said Missy. "He said he would be over in about an hour." "Spec was really psyched about your experience, Zander." "Spec? Okay, cool," said Brian. The boys chuckled at Spec's name. "You want to check out my new pinball video game for a while?" he asked Zander. "Definitely," Zander agreed. "Mom, tell us when Spec gets here," requested Brian. Missy replied, "You bet." When Spec finally arrived, Missy introduced him to the boys. They shook hands, and then they all sat down around the living room coffee table. Spec took an audio recorder and a legal pad out of his bag. "Is Spec your real name?" Brian asked. He and Zander smiled at each other in a smirky way. Spec replied, "I know. It's not a very common name. It's actually a nickname that some of my college buddies gave me because they said I speculated about everything. My given name is Robert." "Oh. Well, I like Spec," Brian said. "That's good," said Spec with a smile. "Now where should we start?" he asked. "What do you know about portals?" questioned Missy. Spec answered, "I know that they are used as a means of going from one place to another, and they are often referenced with other dimensions in space, but I honestly have never seen one. I've never even known of anyone who has." "Zander is the expert right now." Zander was surprised and felt proud. Spec continued, "Zander, I am very interested about your experience, and I know a lot of resources that might be able to answer some of your questions. Do you have any questions?" "Are you kidding?" Zander said sarcastically. "No," replied Spec with seriousness. Then he clicked his pen and turned on his recorder. Zander started rambling about talking birds, furry creatures standing 8 feet tall, pink swamps, and enormous potatoes and watermelons. Spec was astonished and writing fervently. Shortly after, he stopped Zander and asked, "Could you please take a breath for a moment? I need you to tell me everything from the beginning and to speak clearly so that I can have a good recording to reflect on." Zander nodded his head in agreement, took a few breaths, and then explained the entire experience of his journey from the psychic lady at the fair to the time he returned to his backyard. At the end of his explanation, Spec told Zander that he had never heard anything like it. He thanked him for sharing his story with such remarkable details and said he would research as much as he could to find out if any of Zander's experiences matched any other phenomenal experiences. Zander added, "I guess my biggest question is, can I go back to Beanland?" They all looked at Zander with perplexed amazement. "You want to go back?" they all asked in unison. "Sure," replied Zander, and he explained, "It was great. Plus I know that there's a lot more to see, like where Telly lives and what the bottom of the crater is like. I really want to talk to Telly and Surma again, too." "Will you do me a favor and just give me a few days to check some things out?" requested Spec. "Definitely," agreed Zander. "Very good. I'll be in touch. I have a lot of reading to do and some phone calls to make." "Thanks so much for calling me, Missy," Spec said. Then he shook everyone's hand, gave Missy an unexpected peck on her cheek, and left. Zander said, "I should go home now. I think I need to chill. I was a little geared up last night and didn't sleep too well." "All right, Z," Brian nodded in agreement and gave Zander a fist bump. Zander thanked Missy, assured Brian that he would see him sometime in the morning, and then casually walked home, enjoying the familiarity of his neighborhood. Zander noticed that he had a deeper sensitivity and awareness of everything around him. It was a sense of connectivity. He wondered if it had anything to do with his recent travels. This increased empathy created more anxiety about the world, especially when compared to the peacefulness he had felt while in Beanland. It became clear that Madame Lightly was right about Zander having a new view. When he got home, he looked at the notes he had taken after his reading. Madame Lightly told him he would be involved in making big changes. He wondered what that could mean. He sat on the side of his bed, kind of dazed and quiet for a couple of minutes. Then he played his favorite online video game for a while before going to bed. Over the next week, Spec called Missy regularly. She was relaying some of his findings to Zander. Although he couldn't offer many explanations, Spec was becoming obsessively curious about Zander's experience. He longed to find answers to many of the puzzling questions that perplexed him, and he became increasingly interested in traveling to Beanland himself. Portal travel was a huge quest that Spec wanted to experience. He sat down for some serious discussions with Zander at Missy's house. Although he expressed a strong interest in finding out about Beanland's geology and the potential for natural fuel alternatives, he was also very intrigued by the human-animal hybrids Zander had talked about. With little reluctance, it was eventually agreed that Spec should try to portal travel to Beanland. Although they weren't certain he would wind up there, it was a chance Spec was willing to take. After Spec experienced a number of failed attempts to portal travel via other trampolines, Missy and the boys organized a plan for him to use the trampoline in Zander's backyard. Of course, they also had to keep an eye on the weather reports to find a day that would be windy. Everything had to be precisely calculated so that nothing would alarm his parents or sister about the plan. One Saturday, Zander was able to get his family involved in a local walkathon to help raise money for unfortunate children to receive medical care at the local hospital. He felt plenty of guilt about his deception. However, knowing that he and his family were doing something worthwhile and feeling a strong importance about what Spec was going to do made him feel all right about it. Chapter 9. Spec's Journey. He did it! By Saturday midday, Spec was exploring Beanland. It was during what Zander had said was green time, so he knew that the time there was probably a little earlier than it was in Manorville. Freaky, he thought. The green sky definitely made everything look strange, but his eyes seemed to adjust after a little while. Spec looked around in the enormous shed that had all the enormous household objects. It reminded him of the story Jack and the Beanstalk, because it was obvious that a giant somebody had once resided there. The question was, a giant what? While exploring the space, he managed to find a couple of areas that seemed to have large footprints. Spec tried his best to make proportionate sketches of them for documentation. He also saw part of what seemed to be a very large handprint. However, he didn't have the wherewithal to collect evidence of it. Then he started on a trek. As he walked around Beanland, he took samples of some of the vegetation he came across. He sat by a waterfall for a little while. Then he tasted scrapings from the giant carrots. Eventually, he found a sticky pink pond and gathered a sample of that also. He didn't necessarily know how to get around, but he did know that if he could spot a human-headed bird or a huge fuzzy creature, he would probably be able to ask for some assistance. After walking and collecting samples for what felt like an hour, he decided that instead of searching for a summoner or a cause, he would have them find him by drawing attention to himself. Spec began whistling one of his favorite tunes, but that didn't work. "Hello? Hello? Is anybody here?" Spec called out. That didn't work either. As it turned into blue time, he began to feel that he should be preparing to stay through purple time, since that was like nighttime. Plus, he wasn't sure how dark it would get. Since he wasn't positive about finding the shed again, and since he knew that he might be halfway to the crater by this time, he tried to look for a place to climb for a better view of his surroundings. He really hoped to gather more data. He managed to scale a giant cornstalk to get a fairly decent scope of the terrain around him. One particular direction appeared to have a long level area to walk across, which had very little growth. Unfortunately, it was some distance away. Spec looked at his compass, but it was not working properly. He decided to track his course based on the crop field growth. As he continued on, he kept his eyes open for flying summoners. After about 40 minutes, he was nearing the open land. He was still making sounds and whistling tunes to attract attention. Suddenly, he felt the ground vibrating. He heard thumping sounds getting closer, and he sensed that danger could be getting nearer. He quickly looked for a hiding place. The closest spot was a dirt tunnel heading slightly downward into the ground. He ran in and kept still and tucked away until he heard the thumping fade in the distance. Spec did not see the creature he had almost encountered, but as he looked around in the tunnel, he realized that a tank beetle might have been responsible for making it. His instincts encouraged him to seek a more inconspicuous route. The open terrain suddenly seemed quite dangerous, considering the possibility of predators. Spec had only one thing in mind now, and that was to find shelter. Perhaps he could find an elevated area with a niche to get a better idea of a good direction to travel. In order to get back to Manorville, his ultimate goal was to locate Surma. He walked for only a short while when he came upon an enormous tree. It had a brownish-orange trunk with many knots and huge oval-shaped blue leaves. He pulled himself up the very bumpy, rough surface, catching his boots into the deep grooves of the bark. It was an exhausting climb, but well worth the incredible view. Spec felt as though he was on another planet. It had just changed into blue time, yet it wasn't too dark to see. He could make out the field of corn ahead of him, and he thought he could see the roof of the enormous shed that contained the giant objects. He did see the large flat area he had considered crossing earlier, and, in the center of it, he saw a large black circle. "That must be the crater," he mumbled to himself. Spec figured it would probably take a couple of hours to get there. Since he had no energy after his climb, he created a bit of a shelter on a branch. He broke off 3 of the large leaves and placed them on the branch close to the trunk. That was his bedding. He rolled up 1 leaf to create a pillow. He broke off more leaves and stuck them into crevices in the branch above him, creating a makeshift tent. "Not bad," he said to himself as he sat comfortably inside. He ate a granola bar and some raisins he had packed, drank a little water, and then fell asleep. When Spec woke from his slumber, he felt refreshed. He walked out onto the limb, and as he stretched and looked out, he saw a marvelous mixture of red and purple swirls of colors in the sky. It was breathtaking. He wondered about the gases and conditions that created such an awesome view, as you would expect from a scientist. Nonetheless, he had to save his theories for another time, because Spec knew he had to find his way to the crater. He rigged his ropes he'd brought in a way that allowed him to shimmy down the side of the tree. Before he set off, it dawned on Spec that he should have been placing some sort of markers along the way. If he or anyone else were to ever make this journey again, markers would be the best way not only to keep on course, but also to be found if need be. Spec decided to tear his yellow shirt and tie strips of it to branches and stems along the way. Spec did not walk out into the opening. He took a slightly longer route around the border of the opening toward the crater. This would give him some easy cover in the event of extraneous conditions, such as weather or predators approaching. Plus, he might have a better chance of collecting more specimens. It was during this walk that Spec spotted a small flock of summoneers. They seemed to be flying toward the crater. When he gave a blast of a whistle by placing his fingers in his mouth, they immediately stopped in flight and looked around. Spec called out, "Telly! Zander's friend! Telly!" He sort of crouched behind a rock until a bird flew close enough for him to see a human face on it. "Who's there?" one of the summoneers asked. "Telly?" questioned Spec as he showed himself. "No, but I know Telly," the summoneer remarked. Spec stepped out to be seen. "Hello, friend," greeted Spec. "I am from Manorville. My friend Zander recently visited Beanland. Now I came here hoping to speak with Surma. I know that I must walk across this vast area to the crater, but I am unsure of my safety," Spec explained. Then he asked, "Is there anything I should be aware of?" "Zappers may be harmful at purple time, and be aware of ground poppers. Keep your sight focused and walk with care," said the summoneer. "What are zappers?" asked Spec. The summoneer answered, "A zapper is a small flying creature. They do not have eyes, but they get around by sensing a feeling of presence. So, if they are not paying attention, or if you are not paying attention, and you come in contact with one of them, you could get a jolt of a spark or even a burn from them." "It looks like it is still purple time now. Why are you flying around if they are so dangerous?" Spec inquired. The summoneer answered, "Yes, it is changing from purple to red time. My family and I just emerged from a nearby tree. I flew down, curious about who and what you are." Spec briefly explained who he was and why he was there. Then he thanked the summoneer for his words of advice and asked about Telly. "I am sure to see Telly. What is your message?" inquired the summoneer. "Oh, please tell him that—" Spec began saying. "Him?" interrupted the summoneer. Spec responded, "I'm sorry, please tell her," Spec began to ask. "Her?" questioned the summoneer. "We do not go by him and her. We are just summoneer," it explained. "That is fascinating. Perhaps I can learn more about this later," Spec said curiously. "If you would, my message is simply that Spec, a friend of Zander's, would like for Telly to meet him at the crater," instructed Spec. "Do you think you will see Telly before orange time?" he asked. Yep, said the summoneer. Spec gratefully replied, "Thank you so much, but before you go, I forgot to ask your name." "I am Dabble," said the summoneer, and then it flew away. Spec took Dabble's advice and stayed still until it was completely red time. He thought it was extremely important to avoid zappers. "Ugh," Spec said with a sigh. "I never asked about the poppers," he said to himself. Then he deduced, "I guess they probably pop from somewhere, somehow. I better just keep my eyes open." When all signs of purple time ended, he threw on his backpack and walked across the slightly inclined, rippled surface toward what he assumed was the crater. Chapter 10. What's Next? Meanwhile, back in Manorville, Zander had his regular Sunday visit with his grandpa. They took a ride to their favorite bird-watching area, where they sipped on iced tea and enjoyed a private chat about the ways of the world. Afterward, they drove back with the sunroof open and listened to 50s rock music. After a promised game of bananagrams with both his grandparents, Zander and his grandpa built a birdhouse. He noticed that his grandpa was moving slower than his usual self, which showed he was aging. While they worked, they talked about going fishing for tuna. His grandpa thought it would be fun to take him on a charter boat the following summer. Zander thought it was a great idea. It was a memorable visit. Later that day, Missy had the Harmons over for a Sunday dinner. The boys tried to eat without acting noticeably distracted by their concern for Spec. Even though he said he wanted to have a full day of research on Sunday, and they weren't really expecting him until Monday morning, they couldn't help wondering about what he was encountering. The adults chatted a bit about politics, the success of the walkathon, and some other miscellaneous events that were happening in the news. After some time, Zander's father asked, "Why so quiet, boys?" "Oh," Brian said hesitatingly, "we were thinking that there was a new episode of Travel Bandits on tonight," he quickly replied. Zander went along with the fib and interjected, "Yeah, so we're kind of anxious to check it out tonight. We don't want to miss it." Missy suggested, "You can turn on the television after you're done eating." "Okay, Mom," agreed Brian. After dinner, Phil and Grace looked at each other, slightly bored, and then Phil said, "We really appreciate you making this wonderful meal for us, Missy. It was so delicious." "It was," Grace cordially agreed. "I don't think I've ever had kale with rice and beans before." Phil added, "Unfortunately, I am expecting a phone call around 8 o'clock, so I will have to leave in about a half hour or so." "Oh, that's fine. I understand," Missy replied. "Yes, and I will need to make sure that Cindy is ready for her play date tomorrow, so she and I will have to leave when Phil does," said Grace. Being a responsible teenager, Zander was permitted to walk himself home after Travel Bandits. Monday morning couldn't come quickly enough for Zander, Brian, and Missy. Both boys kept wondering about Spec's trip. Brian even had a dream about it. Missy couldn't keep her mind off Spec's journey to Beanland either. They were all feeling anxious and anticipating his return. Their friend hadn't returned that morning, and the day was seeming to drag. They had a discussion about what they were going to do. For now, they were going to wait out the day. Monday came and went. Since Missy was worried about Spec, she decided to stay home on Tuesday. Zander visited in the afternoon. Wondering and worrying together seemed to ease their minds. Missy questioned, "I don't know what to do. I don't think I can wait another day for Spec to get back." Zander responded, "Well, seeing that he left Saturday afternoon, and he said he would like to be there for a couple of days, he should have been back yesterday afternoon." "Yes, he should have been back by now," she expressed. "I feel so responsible for him, getting him involved with this whole thing. I'd just like to know that he is okay," Missy continued. "I've tried calling him on his cell phone, but it keeps going directly to voicemail." "I think that Zander and I should go over," suggested Brian. "What do you think, Z?" he asked. Zander replied, "I don't know. We might not be able to find him." "Or we might," said Brian. "Maybe we can help him with this research," he added. "Or maybe we can have Telly look for him if he's lost or in trouble," Zander suggested. Missy interjected with concern. "Sure, but then I will have to worry about the two of you also. Nothing doing," she insisted. "But, Mom," whined Brian. "You know, Ms. Rubik, I felt very safe in Beanland, especially with the cause. And the portal didn't harm me at all. It was easy," he said convincingly. I don't know. Let me think about it, she replied. I think best when I'm cleaning. I'm going to get some laundry and dusting done. Why don't you boys go to the park or ride your bikes or something, she suggested. Be back in an hour. All right, Mom. Come on, Zander, exclaimed Brian. Instead of doing something like playing basketball or video games, Brian and Zander decided to get their backpacks ready for Beanland. Then they went to Zander's tree fort to discuss their plans. They were preparing to stay there for only one night, which would have them back by Wednesday evening. Zander reminded Brian about the melon juice and the various foods in Beanland, so they were packing only some energy bars and a couple of water bottles. Brian suggested that they could sleep in the huge shed Zander had described, because it was close to the portal site. Great idea, Brian, remarked Zander. Thanks, Z, replied Brian. You know, we still have a problem, said Zander. We do, agreed Brian. If my mom lets us go, how are we going to let Spec know that we're there? He inquired. Zander replied, Wait, I think we have two problems. What's the second one? Asked Brian. How and when are we going to use the trampoline with my family around? Asked Zander. My mom can have them over for dinner again, suggested Brian. Zander replied, Sure, but I'd like to go through the portal before dinner. Besides, I think we are going to have to use your place as cover and ask my folks if I can come over for dinner and a sleepover. A sleepover on a weeknight? Questioned Brian. It's worth a try. After all, it is summer vacation, Zander insisted. I guess you're right, Brian agreed. They both sat quietly for several minutes and thought. Hey, Brian blurted out and continued. Aren't they playing that new princess story at the movies this week? Zander responded, Yes, they are. Cindy loved the first one. I know exactly what you're thinking. My nosy sister can bug my parents to take her to see it. I wonder if there are any matinees playing. Let's check online. Come on. They ran into the house to Zander's bedroom. Cindy spotted them. Hey, she called out. They paid no mind, knowing she would probably follow them. As soon as Zander signed on to the internet and found the movie site, Cindy showed up. What are you doing? She asked. Oh, look, Cindy. Isn't that the princess movie you wanted to see? Zander casually mentioned. Oh, yes! When is it playing? She asked with excitement. Well, let's see, said Zander. There it is, Z, Brian said as he pointed to the show times. Hey, it's playing at 5:45, Cindy, said Zander. Today? She asked. Yeah, he replied. Oh my gosh, Mom! She yelled out as she ran downstairs. Good thinking, Bri, said Zander as they gave a high five. Yes, well, let's find out what happens, said Brian. We will. Let's hang out for a little bit. Cindy might need about 10 minutes to work on my mother's nerves, said Zander. Okay, agreed Brian. They both laughed. When the movie plans were set, the boys went over to Brian's house. Hey, Mom, greeted Brian. Well, what have you two been up to? She asked. Mostly just making plans, he said. I figured as much, said Missy. Yeah, but we're still trying to figure out how to find Spec when we get there, said Zander. That's nice, but I haven't decided whether or not to let you go. I'm still a little worried. But I definitely decided that if you do go, I would want you to go together, said Missy. I'm definitely ready to go this time. Now that I've heard what it's like, I'm not so nervous, said Brian. Besides, he continued, Spec could be back at any moment. Well, I've got a question for you, Zander, asked Missy. How sure are you about knowing that you can get back here? I mean, I know that Surma helped you the first time, but do you really think that Surma will be able to help you again? She questioned. Yes, sure. Definitely. I mean, it was pretty easy the first time. Surma helped me right away. Why would there be any problem? Zander reassured her. Missy shook her head, hesitated, and said, I don't know. Brian chimed in. We already figured out a way to have Xander's family out of the house and at the movies. We could go through the portal at about 5:30, and we can come back in the morning, he explained. What about your flying, talking bird friend? Wondered Missy. That's right. Telly could definitely help us communicate with Spec, answered Zander. Hey, wait a minute. I don't think I want you to go venturing off one way while Spec might be in the completely opposite direction. Oh, and about sleeping there tonight. I don't know about that. Maybe we should just sit tight until Wednesday, suggested Missy. I don't think I can take worrying about you two also. And what am I supposed to tell your parents, Zander? Brian interjected. Just tell them he's sleeping over here. You know, what if Spec needs help, Mom? There was a moment of silence. Then Zander explained, Brian and I will be safe sleeping in the humongous shed. It's abandoned. That's a good shelter for tonight, and it's close to the portal. And we can try to contact Telly from there. Then Telly might be able to find out where Spec is and let him know we're there. We could hang out there, wait for him, and then all come back together at the same time. That's a great idea, Z. The shed can be like our base, agreed Brian. I must admit that does sound like a good compromise, said Missy. She remained quiet for a bit, then agreed. All right, I guess I'll give in. You can go as long as I can go through your backpack supplies with you, she insisted. Yes! Cheered the boys. Then they bumped fists. And you have to promise that you will stay with each other and stick close to the shed while you're over there. No splitting up, she added. Thanks, Mom, said Brian. Yeah, thanks a lot, said Zander. So you promise? Missy asked. Then she added, and I need you both to promise me that whether or not you find Spec, you will both come home by dinner time tomorrow. The boys nodded empathetically. They all smiled in agreement, then they went over the plans.